1, 2, 3, 4.
What kind of pain did that create for you and your business? Guys, first podcast back in the year, and we have Chris Warburton. He's actually one of the members of our advisory board, so he helps us strategically with our vision, our direction, and more importantly, navigating a very complex marketplace that let's be clear, we didn't have an idea about what it meant or what it does until we started working with people like you, Chris. So I'm going to hand it right over to you, Chris. Who are you? What do you do? And the most important question, why should anybody stay on this podcast for the next hour to listen to what you have to say?
Yeah, so thanks, Shane. So Chris Warburton, I'm the director or founder of a company called ROAR.com or RO Strategy, and my background's been in sort of like the collections and credit risk kind of space for the last 30 odd years, really, I suppose, sort of giving advisory around that, both in the UK and then overseas in places like Canada as well. So sort of a bit of an international experience. And I suppose my interest in things is maybe talk a bit about that. I mean, sort of that's been my background, but my interest in things has really been around how do you sort of find areas, and particularly thinking about systems and sort of like processes, how they link together, and areas where they can find like tweaks in terms of like tweaks or areas of process improvement that then have sort of like fundamental changes, sort of like transformational changes in process downstream. So a lot of what I'm about really is around sort of like using data, using technology to sort of like find those areas and find those almost like sweet points to kind of change or transform processes that then has a cascade effect sort of downstream. So hopefully we'll chat a bit about that. There's been so much stuff going on the last 18 months or so, and we were just chatting before around podcasting and some of the stuff that's been going on, and it's just been transformational with things like adoption of new technology, development of new technology, AI's come along, and sort of that's just given us massive amounts of data that's been out there for us to be able to analyze and sort of improve performance, really.
Awesome. So let's say an overall takeaway for that person that's still skeptically said, oh, that sounds good, but what's the overall takeaway that they'll get from this?
So I think hopefully they'll get to understand some of that and get a bit of an overview around what's happening in the receivables market, and also within the in the lending market in the UK, but then also how that process can be sort of like transformed, sort of going forward, really, I think.
Perfect. So where did the journey start for you, Chris? Let's take a step back into our crystal ball. Let's walk back a couple of decades. I'm now in the realm of decades too. So let's walk ourselves back a little bit. Where did the journey start for Chris? What was the first job you had?
Unfortunately, it's probably multiple decades. Unfortunately, my first job, actually, my first job, my very first job, I think was I had a job making fluorescent lights, actually. So that was a summer job I made, and we were punching out the plastic. You remember the old fluorescent lights, the strip lights, that sort of have that sort of like plastic used to go around. We used to sort of do the molding of that, and it was pretty scary because we used to have a massive, great big sort of like a guillotine machine, and it was one of those massive industrial ones. You had to press had both feet and both hands so you could do it, and it literally would take your arm off. It was so that was my introduction to it. And I remember getting told off for working too fast. That was one of the things. That was one of my earliest memories. But then since then I've sort of I went to my background was physics at university, so I was sort of into that numerical kind of area, and I sort of fell into sort of finance, and then sort of like the whole sort of credit risk, operational management type space. Sort of since then.
So finance, I'm sure, had a massive impact in your career, learning about finance. What do you think is the most interesting part about the financial services space where you operated? What caught your attention?
I think, particularly the credit risk space and the I call it risk operations, which is basically that customer lifecycle journey, which is everything from how do you lend money, how do you look at things like fraud, etc., and then how do you look at the collections and recovery process in the background. A couple of things that I really learned there is one is everything's kind of connected, right? So that's the big thing there, which is we often tend to think of particularly the back end process as sort of like being, a tough process at the back end and sort of trying to collect on people who've gone behind in terms of payments, but actually it's really linked to the whole of the product upstream as well. So who you lend money to, can they afford to actually borrow the money, is a fundamental impact in terms of how that then affects the process downstream as well. So really, and particularly at American Express, actually, that we had a real sort of philosophy around how everything is kind of linked together. And often, particularly in the collection space, people don't really like to talk about it, although there's been huge amounts that's been done in terms of customer treatment, but it's often that it's the half of banking that no one wants to talk about. So you don't sort of lend money without making sure that you're reminding people to make payments or supporting them if they can't make payments, those kind of things.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, so it's there, and like everything's linked together, and you've got to have these processes to run really sort of efficient processes, really, but everything's kind of linked. And particularly going back to my sort of science background, is you can sort of model that. So you can model who are the right customers that come through, how do they then get, how do you decide what the risk level is in terms of the customers you're then bringing on, and then there's that whole downstream sort of process implication of that, just like you would have in a physical system, in terms of like what do you need to do all the way along to sort of like change outcomes towards the back end until that sort of recoveries process. So it's, so that sort of linkage together, I think, was a real learning, and I love one of the things I really love is just the data intensity around it. So you can use data to measure things. You can use data to understand behaviors, as an example. You can use data to understand what performance is, understand how a process is working, and you can use that to model it. And once you have a model, you can then use it to then improve it as well.
I remember my first loan approval from Barclays Bank. I had moved to the UK in 2014 from the US. I was always using my dad's credit cards when I was over there, but when I came over here, I worked very, very hard, and inside let's say 18 months, it was around November of 2015, I had managed to earn a little bit of money, more than I had when I started, and Barclays sends this notification, hey, you are approved for a loan, and it's like instant approval. I said, okay, cool. And I kept pushing the plus button, plus, 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 plus. It went to 16,000. My first ever experience with credit. I pushed yes. The money went in my account. I said, Dad, I'm rich. And the payment procedure and the recovery of that lasted up and down. 16,000 then paid off, then 9,000 paid off, then 6,000 then paid off, and it just went up and down until I took out more credit, and I landed myself in a heap of mess. And I can't imagine when you scale that across all of Barclays customers and all of HSBC's customers and all of the other banks' customers, how difficult that can be to manage. So when somebody is hearing this and they've heard a number of things that you've mentioned just now, they heard maybe their first experience just rang a bell in how they took out their first pieces of credit. Where does that credit risk manager, that operational manager, where do they start their journey hearing you today?
Well, but I think going back to your experience, I'm sorry, I'm not avoiding the question. We'll come back to the question. Is the first thing is should you have been lent the money? I think is the first question. Going back to that, right? So there needs to be that adjudication up front in terms of like whether that was an appropriate loan for you or not. Because if you just went out and just like borrowed the whole 16,000, then you're going to have trouble paying it back, right? So that's an illustration of how everything's linked together. Often in the back end, in terms of the collections pieces, then how do you then get supported? And the industry has been fantastic the last sort of like 10 years or so in terms of supporting people who do fall into arrears or do have financial difficulties, those kind of things. And they've been fantastic around supporting that. So making sure that in this case you would have had the tools to make sure it's supported. Is there debt advice, those kind of things. I mean, there's been a real sort of sea change in the industry. It's been very interesting to kind of watch. In terms of like training, I suppose for people who want to get into that, understanding how you sort of like model this stuff and understand how all these sort of levers work. I mean, I think the data element is sort of important, and that's often a good place to kind of start, and understanding sort of like how things link together. I don't think I haven't seen sort of specific training sort of independent, although there probably is through things like CICM, etc., to understand how everything links together. Where I kind of learned it was we had our own internal training course where we would look at, as an example, it's a fantastic course course, we would look at the dynamics of credit cards. It was in those days, which is like, how do you almost like run it like a game, which is how do you decide who to lend the money to in the right that's going to be affordable.
Yep.
If they're not, how do you make sure you're talking to people at the right time, making sure you're supporting people in the right way, and then what does that do in terms of profitability as well? So which is also the other kind of aspect as well. So we had our own internal kind of training courses, which is which was just fantastic. I mean, there's an amazing grounding in the business. Some of the big banks have those, but a lot of this stuff is actually done sort of like on the job, really, I think.
Do you think people should learn about this stuff then in school?
Absolutely.
But like let's say a high school, college, we get these college loans that come out to play. And there is nothing at all that I ever learned in any course that taught me, or it gave me the exposure in learning how credit actually works. Because the 16,000 sounds good. When it goes into your account and you have an available balance of 16,000, that is awesome. But once you spend it, and then had I realized the £470 payment that was my monthly payment that I thought was manageable, where 60% of it was interest, or even more, and only a tiny portion was principal, and how long that lasted, over 5 years, it's an incredibly huge amount, and it's quite worrying, and it is a problem that we're facing today. It's also why you're brought into the company. It's what VRS is all about. It's where Kevin Still is adding value. What are your thoughts on that, on the lack of awareness, the lack of exposure to knowledge and information on how credit is used, so that when consumers issued credit to use, that your jobs on the other side are a little bit easier to manage?
I mean, absolutely. I think there should be more education. There are pockets of it out, but it's not sort of like structured as sort of standard within the national curriculum that I understand. Sort of like, and I think they could do a lot more with that. I also think that even if you're training people or kids at a very relatively young age, it's not just necessarily training the kids; it's also around helping their parents as well. So it's
Yeah.
you're advising the kids. And then there's take-home information that can actually help with things like debt advice, debt support, which actually can be useful leaflets for the parents, because people typically, they'll get into these sort of issues probably around sort of like in their 20s or
Yep.
30s, those kind of
Yep.
things. Often when life catches up with you, you get married, you have kids, your expenditures suddenly go up, and then you have something then happens, right? So
Yep.
and that's often kind of what happens. So it's often that kind of there's a double sort of opportunity
Double-edged
there
sword.
to
Yeah.
to help educate the kids, but also provide support for parents as well. So I think
Absolutely.
I think there's definitely more that could be done. There are some programs, and some of the banks go out. And they'll have sort of like smaller education programs. I think there's obviously much more we can do on a much wider basis to help people understand, what does APR mean? What does that physically mean in terms of your outgoings if you borrow that kind of amount? Because that kind of happens. And I do think, just in sort of defense of the regulator, I mean, the regulator's aware of that. A lot of their new legislation around things like consumer duty, making sure there's good value, is sort of with that sort of in mind, in terms of making sure that people are only borrowing if they can afford it, making sure those checks and balances are there from the company point of view as well, but also making sure it's offering, I suppose, fair value to consumers as well, and people actually understand it as well. So it's going on in the background. I think, if anything, the criticism is probably it's a little bit too slow, particularly from the education piece. But I don't think you'll find anyone in the industry who doesn't think that. To be
Yeah.
honest, it's inertia in terms of why isn't it happening.
So, what is the most common problem that comes you as a consultant, as an expert in the space? What's the most common problem that comes across your desk when a company says, "Hey, I'm dealing with this. I need your help"?
It depends. It depends on the year, right? So often there's the swings and roundabouts in terms of what are the hot topics of the moment. So I would say that 6-7 years ago, it might have been around bad debt levels. We were in a recession, let's say, and so people are saying, well, look, more people can't afford to pay, so there needs to be remedial action to then work out, well, then how do you support those customers? Then if you're in good times, it tends not to be bad debt levels that sort of drives drives work as much as like, well, how can we then become more efficient, right? Because you don't have high bad debt levels, so you have to then work out how you can be more efficient. So that drives activity around looking at automation, looking at process improvements, those kind of things. I would say at the moment, one of the biggest issues, particularly in the UK, is regulation, right? So regulation has been a huge topic for the longest time. It's driven an awful lot of conversion into an activity around digital, because the regulatory environment that's been put in has cost firms a lot of money. So they've had to put in extra processes, so they're reacting to that by basically putting in digital processes on top. So it's sort of like the regulatory piece has been an important part in terms of compliance, but then also, I suppose, then the technology to then make sure you are then compliant at the lowest cost. That kind of makes, so it kind of changes. It changes over time, I think.
What technology are you seeing have the most impact on compliance today in your field?
I don't think it's technology. A technology becomes an enabler to either become more compliant, or to report that you are compliant. So I think the biggest enabler that out there at the moment is data. And the data allows you to monitor if you're compliant. It allows you to monitor your performance and to work out if there are gaps or not. And data has been sort of increasing exponentially. And I think rather than it being a technology, I think the data is the important piece that allows you to do it. So if you look at AI as an example that's come over the last sort of 18 months or so, obviously it's been pretty exciting. We're all pretty familiar with it now. But the real thing it allows you to do is it allows you to process more data, particularly unstructured data. It allows you to interpret the data and then generate more data as well. So I think a lot of this stuff comes back to data in terms of like, does it kick off more data? How do you understand it? And then how do you use that to measure performance? And then what does that mean for your processes going forward? So I think
What's the
I think data is the most important kind of element, if that kind of makes sense, Shay.
Yeah, of course, of course. So where's the starting point for understanding data? Where should companies be starting their understanding of data in their journey to optimize these processes, to optimize how their productivity is, to optimize the customer experience? Where does the journey start?
Well, I think it probably starts at the base account management kind of level. So if I was ever in a company, one of the most basic things you need to have is, where are your accounts, or the customer accounts? What's the
Mm,
current status of the account, and the information that sort of sits within the receivable system around that. So you need to know where they are and where they are within the journey. That becomes the most basic element. So I call it sort of inventory management, which
mhm,
is, you understand where they are in the journey, what's happened to them, those kind of things, and then everything else then gets layered on top of that. So it might be spend data, which is then how did they get to that. It might be call data in terms of like what calls have happened associated with that. Then with call data, you then might want to say, well, look, that was a voice call, or an AI call. What's the transcript of that, and what did the customer actually say? And then you can
mhm.
analyze that. So everything kind of links off those accounts, the account level data. So I think that's the first place to start, and then you almost like draw it out almost like a spider from that into all the different elements. I mean, there's different techniques you can use in terms of what you want to kind of achieve, but I think that at a core level, that sort of inventory kind of data is a good place to kind of start. But you've got to have it in the right level of detail. That's the only other thing I'd say, which is, it's important to have it almost like at an actionable detail that you can really understand what's going on. So you don't just sort of have summary level. We've all seen these sort of like dashboards and sort of almost like dials on the aeroplane sort of thing, right? So
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah. I love
uh,
those.
yeah, but unless you can drill down to the next level down, I mean, those are very interesting. They tell you that you're going too fast or you're going too slow. But let's say let's use a different example. Your engine warning light goes on. That's great. There's a problem, but you need to be able to drill down to then find out where the problem is. Otherwise, you can't do anything about it. So it's great to have these high level dashboards, high level compliance dashboards, but you really sort of got to get underneath the skin and make sure you have enough detailed data to be able to sort of diagnose it and then fix it, and then even remediate issues as well. So that's the important piece. So it's much bigger than just sort of like, here's a flashy dashboard. It's
Mhm.
let's go into a more sort of detailed kind of kind of basis.
So I know that finding problems is very easy to do, right? Finding problems is very easy to do. I come across hundreds of problems every single day that are brought to my
Mm.
desk. Now, finding that one solution that actually works, though, ends up being where value is provided. So, what does the perfect data set look like for a massive account that's been lent credit?
What is there a perfect data set? Is there a
As
perfect
good as
data
it
set?
can get. As good as it
Yeah.
can get. What is as good as it can get?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a perfect data set. I think you'd want to know everything you can really about the account. I think what's interesting with some of the new technologies coming on is you don't have to be quite as picky on the information as you used to be. So it used to
Okay.
be, well, sort of like, you'd have, what the age of the account is, what the balance is, or some demographic information, this kind, and you're limited by how much information you can store.
Mm-hmm.
Now, now you can store a huge amount of data on an individual, and making sure it's appropriate to store it, I would say. But obviously then you can then analyze that, and then are some of those elements sort of being predictive or being indicative of potential other problems. So I'm not sure there's a perfect sort of like data set. It depends
Yeah.
on what the question you want to ask it is,
Mm-hmm.
almost like, to a certain extent. But these days, I mean, having more data is much easier to process than it was, and it can be insightful in terms of like drawing linkages or working out where there might be issues, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One other comment on data I'll just say is, we often talk about calls as an example, and sort of, we talk about agents, and we're talking about AI agents as well, right?
Yep.
We've been talking a lot about that, sort of like, AI voice agents. What's interesting is a lot of the human interaction we have. So even if it's an AI agent talking to a customer, it's actually the customers, we're actually giving away information. I'm giving information to you now about my background, right? Most of the time we don't record any of that. So I mean, we're recording this, but normally if you're having a conversation with someone in a shop, you're giving away information around sort of like, well, I'm interested in this particular yogurt or this particular butter, or I'm looking for this yogurt, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
um, it doesn't go anywhere. It just sort of goes out into the ether. You've had a conversation with someone. In the
Yeah.
future, that's actually data that can be actually useful in terms of predicting, whether someone's maybe they're in financial difficulties, or maybe they got a change in habit, and there's some other way you can actually help them. And I think what we're moving towards, particularly with some of the AI stuff, is sort of recording that. So, a good agent, or if we're having a conversation, you might say, well, look, Chris, you're looking a bit tired today. You've obviously, you've had a long night, or, is everything okay? Human beings, we sort of analyze that, and I think with the new sort of technology that's coming out, we're going to be able to get machines to analyze that, and that's pretty powerful in terms of offering customized journeys, offering customized help to people, just in a way that a human would as well. So we're sort of like being able to gather that information, be able to use that information really to get better customer outcomes, I think. So
Oh my God, the impact that AI and understanding my customer, especially through meetings, introductory meetings, discovery meetings, the impact it has had has been tremendous. And exactly to your point, every single call that I've had over the past 4 years has this little Fireflies note taker. Anybody who's had a call with me
mm,
knows who that is. You've got Otter, you've got all kinds of ones, and the development of the outcomes that it provides in terms of summaries, key points, questions, takeaways, all of that, it fast tracks everything in your customer experience, because now you can literally design the entire journey from any one of those conversations, and it can be so concise. It makes a huge, huge, huge difference. And it's one of the things that we're trying to pay attention to at Mega today, which is to understand the customer journey very, very well, get into the details of it, understand the nuances of each conversation, and then to apply technology and AI in a reasonable, effective manner so it creates an impact that delivers the outcomes that all of these companies want, right?
but what's kind of interesting with that, and even just taking note taking as an example, or meeting notes as an example, is you look at like how that whole journey around AI has kind of changed. So like 18 months ago, we were kind of like, well, do I really want to have my meeting recorded? Do I really want to, is that really the right thing to do? Or there's going to be hallucinations around it. But now, sort of sitting where we are today, you probably get a lot less resistance than you ever had before. If you look at things, I was buying something from Amazon as an example, that's got AI written in it, right? So you can get product
Yeah.
recommendations, there's AI
Yeah.
on it. So even over the last sort of like 12 months or so, it's become increasingly more accepted, and we've just got used to it. And it kind of feels like that's the journey we're on, where everything's going to be sort of like, I don't say everything's recorded, but things are going to be sort of, we're going to be able to access that data, and then be able to use that data and mine that data to work out, well, what is actually going on for people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How do we change our products and services to make it better for customers?
Absolutely. And I want to backtrack just a little bit before we get into the AI segment, because we are going to touch on it. And what you're pointing out just now is a plethora of experience, a ton of knowledge about how this industry has evolved, how people have evolved from what you're doing today. When did you start your consultancy?
Oh, I started doing it. What must have been? Well, I left doing, I suppose, call center management probably about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. I think it was. I've been in sort of consultancy for around about that kind of length, in various guises. So be doing it there, which was it's very interesting. I would say, going from call center leadership, and sort of like having that day-to-day responsibility and sort of having to own and implement things, to sort of sitting on the outside and the other side of the fence and being able to say, well, look, this is how you should be doing things.
Yeah.
Both of them have challenges, actually, in terms of like, I mean, actually, and all hats off to the folks in the operational side of things, which is getting stuff done is not easy. Getting stuff done is pretty difficult. And I mean, people there are really dedicated, and you meet a ton of really great people, I would say. However, I think the challenge that sits with that is often you're so busy, you don't necessarily get to see the wider picture around what's going on in the rest of the world, which is the piece I found so interesting, sort of moving to almost like the consulting side of the fence, which is now you get to go to the conferences, you get to sort of speak at the conferences, you get to see what the latest technology is, you get to see how things are changing, which is really some of the stuff I've done more recently, which is like, you know, how is it changing, and the impacts of those changes. The speed of development has just been sort of like increasing at a lightning fast rate, and it's like,
Mhm.
it's so exciting to sort of see that. And really what I'm kind of keen around is like, how can some of those technologies be used in the operational process to really make people's lives better, because there's an awful lot of hard work going on there, and I think sometimes you can find new different techniques to sort of make their lives much easier, make people's lives much easier.
Absolutely. And before you got to that point, though, where you got to speak at conferences, understand the other side of the picture, one thing we pay attention to in this is, what was that trigger moment where you'd had enough of being an employee, and then you said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. This is too big of a problem. I can solve it myself. And then you made the jump. Was there ever a moment like that or something similar?
I think I like talk in terms of like some of the some of the speaking stuff. I've always enjoyed speaking, so I've always enjoyed some of the new ideas. I've always liked to do that. The opportunity came up really through the pandemic to do much more of the videos, as an example, and sort of do that and sort of take an even wider view around sort of what's happening in the future. Where there was less sort of busy work that was happening at that time, and so it sort of became an opportunity to really sort of like, I suppose, feed a bit of a passion around sort of like finding out what's going on out there. I mean, even in the consultancy world, you can spend an awful lot of time sort of like, being very busy, sort of helping people, but you can sort of take a bit of a step back during the pandemic and say, well, look, what else is going on there? There's a huge need for it, because people were basically sitting at home saying, what do I do now, right? So that was really the opportunity, I think.
But again, so 10 years ago, we're talking 2015, right? So you're an employee, you're going to be an entrepreneur. For me, my situation, I'll give you an example. My situation was, I was working at a publishing company. I was making a very good amount of money. I was making double my commission. The commissions were double my salary. And I was in a good place. But the first experience I had with a customer who pulled me up on something that wasn't my fault, I can own when it is my mistake, but our team was delivering webinars. You're very familiar with how webinars work, and you bring attendees to view those webinars. And when they're company webinars, you expect the right people to show up for those webinars. And the company I was working for that were delivering those webinars were supposed to bring qualified delegates to those webinars. And they were calling people and saying, hey, just join this webinar. Can I sign you up? You don't even have to join. And the client that I was working with, it was an oil and gas service company. So they were dealing with the end users, and oil and gas is quite a close-knit community. And they knew everybody. So he checked the list and he called up one of the guys and he said, hey, thanks for joining the webinar. Anything interesting that you're paying attention to? And the guy said, I never signed up for the webinar. And he called me and said, Shane, you are a liar. I've said this a few times on the podcast. And for me, I was actually buying my wife makeup at Westfield and having this call, and he ripped me a new one. And it felt so shit. It felt awful. It was a horrible experience to have somebody speak to you like that, and you didn't have the answer. And when I called my marketing team and asked them, hey, what happened here? They said, we've hit the number. That's the contract. That's all you need to worry about. I said, I quit. I'm done with you guys. I'm never going to work for you guys again. And I went and started my company. And in 3 weeks, I had generated 3 new clients, £21,000 in revenue. And after that, it was just everything put behind me, and I just took off. Was there ever a moment like that for you? It doesn't have to be as extreme, but before you made the jump, there's always a trigger. There's always a reason to move.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's having done having done the operational piece for a while, I think there was a bit of a frustration there, probably around sort of like, it is so busy and not being able to get out to see that wider kind of picture. I think as much as anything, that's what I've most enjoyed in terms of sort of like switching across. I think, but that's I wouldn't say that's necessarily a trigger as much as that's been there for a while. So it's almost like, do you go out and as you get older, do you want to go out and sort of like scratch the itch that you've always had and sort of get the opportunity to do it, and then are you sort of opportunistic, I suppose, in terms of sort of like following that? So when there's the opportunity, and particularly on some of the particularly on some of the leading edge stuff, in some of the technology that's kind of looked at, I mean COVID was just around like taking the opportunity at the right time to be able to do that, because technology's been changing, podcasts have been expanding, the ability to be able to create some of the content, the cost of that's been sort of coming down. What's really missing for a lot of folks is like, do they have the knowledge and the access to be able to find out what's going on? And that's something that in the consultancy world, and sort of like, if you have the time to be able to do it, is possibly able to do it, and it leverages my experience. So that some of that piece is kind of like opportunistic, I think, to a certain extent, and sort of being able to sort of like capitalize on some of that. But it's not an easy path, I'd say, but not an easy path, I don't think.
I would agree. And again, the opportunity I saw was, okay, I make X amount of money a year with my base salary and I do this, but I'm generating £700,000 of cash for this company and they're only giving me 10%. What on earth is going on? I want more of that money. I can go get that. And that was the opportunity where obviously earning potential became a part of it. But one thing I realized very quickly was that I was not able to replicate myself in my business. And that became a big problem. And that was half of the journey where I had to navigate through problems and identify solutions and scalability. What's it like, or what was it like in your first few years? I've asked all of my guests this question. What was it like in your first few years of building your business?
Well, I think scalability is still an issue for me as well, right? Which is, I think that's an issue in terms of like, and if you delegate to someone, then you have to then manage that. So there's an overhead that's sort of like this sort of linked to that. I think the one thing that's sort of changing over the last few years is technology allows you to become more effective. So as Shane, you can still do what you do, but you're now much more efficient, and you can use the technology to become more scalable. So a lot of us are sort of scaling using technology essentially at the moment. And I think that's, even in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, that sort of like that continues to change. And I think we're only at the start of that. There's still that nugget, and the piece that's difficult is the nugget of creativity, right? So and how do you do that? And particularly if that's your brand. So in your case, if that's your brand in terms of like how you're questioning people, how you're talking to people, those kind of things, that's hard to replicate. And if someone does replicate it, then it becomes, is it still your podcast or those kind of things? So it's like, so you've got to think about some of those kind of elements, I suppose, in terms of like, what is your brand, and then how do you then sort of have services or either automated services or people around that can almost like magnify it rather than replicate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. You make a ton of sense there. Before we go into the AI segment, I want to ask you, while you was building your business, I'm sure you came across hard times. What kept you afloat when the times got tough?
I think having good contracts and having good relationships with people, I think, is the most important piece, right? So, are you delivering value for people? Do you have good relationships? Is it, are you seen as sort of delivering value? I think is the most important piece, because, repeat customs are big part of sort of like, keeping revenue, right? So
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. Working hard kind of helps. I think that I'd say that the biggest piece that I kind of struggled with is sort of, how do you balance multiple clients at the same time or multiple priorities at the same time? Because you need to, even where you are in consulting, you're sort of like, you're delivering something for a client, and obviously that's often revenue generating, but you also need to be doing the research stuff, and you also need to be doing the marketing piece. You need to be making the contacts. You need to be doing the pre-sales piece, and all that needs to happen, which is not revenue generating, for you to get the next piece of work. So otherwise you have these huge sort of like, feast and famine kind of elements. So that's the piece that's really, really tough. And that's something, frankly, if you work in a large corporate, you don't have to worry about, because if you've got a quiet period, you still get paid. If you've got a
Yeah.
busy period, you still get paid, even if you don't get everything done that day. So you sort of like that peaks and troughs piece is the really difficult piece about sort of like, doing some of the stuff, independently.
What's the best advice you got from a mentor or a coach in your consulting journey that helped you get through it?
Best advice, I think the best advice is, I don't know how best to answer that.
It's a hard one.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to like some of the best advice that I've had, and I'm not going to talk just about the consulting piece. I think is, people I really admire, some of my previous bosses, are results are really delivered through people, right? So I think, it's really got to look after the people. And I think, although right at the top I said I'm all about the numbers, is right, how the model, those kind of things. At the end of the day, businesses are people things, customers are people, and if you can find the way or the system to sort of incentivize people to achieve better performance, that they can see themselves being more successful, they can see themselves getting more of what they want, that's the optimal kind of place to be. And I've seen it done a couple of times, and I've been part of organizations that have just flown as a result of that, where everyone is basically, they got some autonomy, they can basically work on their own, they've got objectives they need to hit, and it's like, how do I help people achieve that? So I think that's the best advice, I think, which is, it goes down to like, how do you find things that customers really want? How do you make sure that you're keeping clients happy? All of that. And it's really around like, how do you find those one or two enablers, rather than trying to just force through tons and tons of action, sort of like top down, heavy handed. It's like, how do you find one or two trigger points that can make the dramatic difference, and really let the people run with it, so they get the success. And I think that's
I
probably
really
the best
like.
advice. That's the best advice. And I've seen it done. I can't say I'm perfect doing it, but that would be something I'd aspire to. So,
I love that. I do. I really do love that, because one thing that was hard for me was to let go of control. I was a big control freak in my first my run through as a business owner, and one of my mentors, Marcus Kalki, absolutely fantastic mentor, taught me so much. He said, "Shane, let go of it. Let
mm,
go of the control. Let go of your ego. Let them
mm,
fail." And I said, "Well,
mm,
what if they screw up the business? Then I don't have
mm,
any
yeah.
money." And he was just, "Let them fail. Let them fail and learn." And that became the mantra: fail fast, guys.
Mm,
Get it done, and then learn how to bounce back. And that was probably the best advice I could get, because I was able to scale very, very quickly to 15 people. Payroll is an absolute nightmare. But again, when good problems arise, it's as a result of a huge action. So as we move into this AI segment now, which is the last half an hour of what we are going to speak about, a lot of people want to hear views on their opinion or your perspective on how you believe AI has evolved in our industry. Let's just say over the past 18 months. How do you think it's evolved?
Well, I usually start off, if I do my talk on AI, is like AI is nothing new, right? I think
Yeah.
AI has been around since the 1970s and 1960s. I mean, it depends on the definition of AI. What has changed has been data and processing power. A lot of the
Mm,
maths has been around, right? And really just being able to do it on a much larger scale. We've had transformer technology and that kind of thinking that's come across, which is the new LLM stuff. But I think it's, the processing power has been sort of dramatic. And I think, I think it's had a dramatic change. It's obviously the Chat GTP chat interface. I think particularly has created a lot of excitement, but I
hmm
think we're only kind of getting started with it. I mean, it was almost like magic when it first came out, but actually, as I say, I think the ability to be able to take large passages of text, large passages of data, large passages of computer code, and generate that as it comes out, I think becomes really sort of like game changing. And I think we're
mm.
only at the very start of it. Really think we're only at the very start of it. I think, there's the stuff that we do as consumers, which is, generating, funny poems, those sorts of things, or generating pictures. Usually it's pictures over Christmas. That was a new thing. It's like funny Christmas pictures, which are AI generated. But once you start linking that together and you start putting that in the business processes, all this thing around AI agents, which is like, how do you take it and do different steps? You can basically, do things that you might employ someone to do to basically say, look, I need to create this table. I need to extract the data from this. It's something you get someone to do. I need to interpret this particular piece of work, and then generate this output and be able to link that together, just like we would with the process with humans, but replace the humans allows us to do it much faster. You can get more data, more detail, those kind of things as it comes through. So I think we're only starting to scratch the surface on it. I really do, but it's
hmm
almost like the sexy stuff is out there. Now the hard work kind of starts, which is how do you plug this stuff into your existing systems? How do you make sure it's controlled? How do you make sure you got the right guardrail sitting around it? How do you make sure you got auditability around it? So all of these steps are basically recorded, so you can then go back and say, well, look, these are the steps it went through. We can do all this stuff, but it just takes time to do it. It needs to be plugged into our existing processes. How do we redesign our existing process today to make it more AI ready? Because a lot of our processes are so woolly often, which is, well, sometimes I do this, and if I do it after I go and get a cup of tea, then I do it slightly differently. Those sort of things. It's like, how
Yeah.
do you put process design to make it sort of more repeatable, more systematic? But we've got new techniques to handle a lot more sort of like fuzzy kind of processes and be able to automate them, and it's faster as well. I think the other thing, it's faster for people, so faster and more responsive. So I think we're only at the beginning of the change. I really do.
And I think you've answered it, but if I were to ask you again and you were to give a different answer, how do you believe operational teams, credit risk teams, credit control teams, how do you believe they should be starting their journey on AI? How should they be using it today with what we have available?
I think a lot of it comes down to finding specific use cases. So we talked last year a lot about these are all the things we do, and a lot of the times we sort of spend sort of looking at sort of like 5, 10 years in the future, and we're sort of like we're painting this vision of sort of like Star Trek or the future or those kind of things. Um, the reality is. We've got to sort of think much more practically now, which is where are the pain points in the process? How do we understand what those pain points are? The normal rules apply. Where does it cost? Where do we have defects? Those kind of things. And then is AI potential to be used in a solution? So typically we might use robotic process automation, which is sort of, branch and tree decision kind of networks. Now we can use AI to maybe develop that much more quickly.
hmm
So I think particularly for the operational teams, it's like, how do you find specific use cases? So as an example, quality monitoring might be one. Voice analytics is another. Two-way bot conversations is another. Right at the leading edge are things like voice conversations is another, right? So like, how do you then have interactive voice conversations with people? All of these things are specific use cases that fit into our existing process. So we don't have to rethink the process. It just solves a problem and a use case for that particular element. So I think that's the
Wow.
that's the place to start. Like, it's a very specific kind of like, this is going to add value, and we can measure that.
So if you were to make a prediction of where we're going over the next 12 months, let's just say by the end of December this year, where do you believe our industry, our market, where you specialize, where do you think it's going?
I think we're going to a much more sort of automated place. I think there'll be much more. I think consumers are going to get used to having much more customized processes, processes that mean something for me. And we're almost like we're going. It's almost like I was going to say we're going back to the future. We're going back to the way it used to be, back to the day of the bank manager, right? So where you would go in and you would say, in the old days, people always talk about, oh, I used to go in and talk with the bank manager. They would know what we did. They would know more around, what our situation was. And they'd make an appropriate decision based on me, right? That's what we all want. What's happening is the technology is catching up with almost like that old vision to a certain extent. So we're going to get
Yep.
that. But I think we're going to get that through technology. So the AI is going to be almost like the future bank manager that knows about us. We'll ask the questions. We'll get some of that indirect or anecdotal information from the conversation. They'll be able to use that to then make a decision based and customized on, what we as a customer actually want, advising us in the right language at the right level, so we understand how much money we're going to have to pay back each month, as an example, making sure we understand these things. All of that can be put within the system, and it can be done automatically. And it's almost like going back to the way it used to be, but just doing it in an automated fashion. I think that's where we're going. I don't think it's going to get rid of people necessarily.
No.
I think what's going to happen is all of us are just going to spend more time doing more value added stuff, more important things that humans are good at, rather than some of the more straightforward stuff. I mean, I use the analogy of the invention of the car. What the invention of the car means that I now no longer have to go and walk to the nearest town. I don't have to spend my time doing that. I can drive to it, and then I can get stuff done when I'm there. So it's actually helps my life and allows me to do the more important things, rather than me spending my time putting one foot in front of the other. I think the same thing is going to happen in business and call centers as well.
I would agree. What do you think are the biggest concerns with AI, with the use of AI over the next 12 months?
I think privacy and data, if people think about it, will still be a concern. I think the hallucination piece, which you talked about, which is making up facts, I think is sort of going to fade a little bit. I think privacy and making sure that you can sort of really stand behind the decisions, I think are going to be issues. I think a couple of other issues that will probably come up down the road. One of which is these AI systems probably have to be better than humans. So we sort of accept that humans make mistakes. We don't accept that computers make mistakes. So I think that's one thing we're going to have to get through, because with AI sort of being a human, a computer, I think the other piece is we've got to be really careful that we don't almost like over communicate and blow up the system as well, which is, I think I'm seeing it. I get more spam email than I've ever had before. I think AI is making it worse. You can tell the AI emails because they've got emojis in them. I tend to feel that. But I think we're almost like we're over communicating, and I now have to have AI to handle the AI emails, and so we're almost like in this arms race. And I think we've got to be careful around making sure we're not sort of like generating so much data that what we do say becomes irrelevant. I think that's going to be important as well.
I think that's the most important thing of the show. I think that's the most important thing you've highlighted right there. There is so much going on, and then it happened the other day. I asked a friend of mine, "Hey, send me your opinion of what you think my biggest strengths are." He's a lyricist. He's very, very good in linguistics, and again, I couldn't tell it apart. Is this AI or is it actually him? Is this genuine? Is it authentic? And those two questions are definitely the most important. So, if we were to wrap this up on a high note, then there are people looking for opportunity. There are people looking for growth. What is the biggest opportunity that presents itself in 2025 from where you sit?
I do think. I mean, I'll go back to the AI stuff. I think you've got to be aware of what's going on in the background and sort of stay ahead of it. I think that's a huge opportunity. I think there's huge opportunities to to educate yourself and find out around what's actually happening, but also find out about new thinking techniques, because all of a sudden I think it's like the early days of the internet. I see it like the early days of the internet and HTML programming. I don't know if you ever did that. It was easy in the first day, in the first couple of years. We all could get a handle on it, but it very quickly, if you didn't keep up with it, you fell behind. So I think being on top of it now, really understanding what's going on. I think using AI to probably educate yourself around, and that's the other thing that's happening. I mean, the ability to be able to capture information is just fantastic at the moment. So using that to sort of stay ahead and and be able to be competitive for the new jobs that are going to come through, I think is really important. I think that's what people have got to focus on. I think if we sit back and we just say, well, it's going to fade away, or it's we don't need to worry about sort of like keeping my skills fresh, that's the piece where you're more likely to fall behind. So I think there's a real opportunity for people to sort of stay ahead and be into this kind of stuff, to learn about it. And I think if you do it, then you've got a pretty bright future. I think if we sort of sit back and think everything's going to be like it was in 1990, then I think we're going to struggle.
100%. You could really upskill yourself massively. I worked with one person that's working with me right now. I won't say his name yet, but he wasn't as effective as he is today with the use of AI. And I mentioned a lot of this content that's produced on this podcast is from somebody who, without AI tools, would be a fish in water, right? He'd be sunk. But with the use of AI, he is creating. I've consulted with an agency. The stuff I do would cost me about three to $4,000 a month to create, because of the cost, because of the ability, and obviously where I'm recruited from. I spend a fourth of that. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Things like AI video is only just starting, right? So, I mean, why fly the helicopter over the cliffs to get that perfect panoramic shot where you can just put a quick prompt into one of the things, right? I mean, it's like it, and then guess what? And then the client comes back and they says, well, actually, I want the lighthouse that was there in red, not in white. You just go back and recreate it. I mean, it's just like, how much money does that save, right? So.
That's a hefty amount. So, Chris, any last words before we wrap up the show?
I don't think so. Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been great chatting to you. I think we've got to keep our eye on the future, really. I think sort of staying ahead of it, staying on top of it, something that definitely I'm trying to do, and I know you're trying to do. So, I'm in both of our content. So, so I'd sort of, welcome anyone who wants to chat about it, really. So,
where can they chat with you? Where can they find you?
roar.com. So ro-ar.com is the place to go.
Anywhere else? LinkedIn? Do you want them to call you?
No,
Email?
LinkedIn. I'm all over LinkedIn,
Uh-oh.
so they'll find me.
All right, cool. And that's it. That's a wrap, guys.
Thanks, Shane.